Good afternoon. My name is Derek Olson. I'm the president of WorldOregon, and it's wonderful to have you here today for our midway point through our Great Decisions discussion series with Professor Angélica Durán-Martínez from the University of Massachusetts in Lowell, talking about drug policy in Latin America. It should be a fascinating discussion. I was just mentioning, I served in foreign service in Latin America during some of the years in question, so I'm looking forward to hearing her discussion of this. For those of you who joined the program we did this morning, you'll know it's been a Latin America day for us. We had a program this morning at 9 a.m. Pacific about the Cuba embargo 60 years after it was started. Before we dive into today's program, just a couple words about the webinar. For those of you who've been to these before, you'll know these points, but just to highlight, this is intended for WorldOregon members and the general public. Your membership dollars help support programs like this. If you're not a member yet, I encourage you to go to worldoregon.org and become a member. Hope that some of you, I know, were able to join the discussion group we had yesterday for the last week's program, and that's a really neat new part of what we're trying out this year in partnership with Portland State University. So keep an eye on future ones of those. And a lot of new programs we put up, a new one coming up with our perennial favorite presenter, Oregon State University, Chris Nichols, on the pandemic as it hopefully moves to, or maybe not hopefully, but as it transitions to endemic. What does that mean? Looking at the 1918 pandemic. So there's some really, that program and some other really interesting ones up there. So take a look at our events page and hope to see you soon on others. Again, a reminder that you are all muted with your video off. Please post your questions in the Q&A, which Tim will moderate for our speaker, and we will post links in the chat. And now to today's program. So today's program is on drug policy in Latin America, which has been a controversial subject and it should be a really interesting discussion. And our professor, Angélica Durán-Martínez, has a great deal of experience doing research and speaking on issues like this. Joining us from the University of Massachusetts in Lowell. Her full bio was in the email that you received, the Know Before You Go. It's also linked to on our website. It's an honor to have her with us. I want to make sure she has full time for her presentation, so I'm going to pass it over to her. Thanks again, Professor, and thank you, audience, for joining us, and post your questions in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much, Derek, and thank you so much to Tim for the invitation. It is really a pleasure for me to be here with such an interesting audience. So what I'm gonna do today, I know that you were all reading a chapter by Monica Serrano, who is a colleague that I respect tremendously, which I think really provides a really nice overview of some issues to think about when we think about drug policy and violence and drug trafficking and its consequences in Latin America. So what I'm gonna do today is really add more detail into some of that picture that was in that document. And also towards the end, I think complicated a little bit more by talking about the importance of the domestic issues and the complexity of domestic politics and domestic dynamics when we think about the consequences of drug trafficking in Latin America. So I think before I start, I would like to illustrate some of the things I'm gonna talk about today with a very interesting contrast, which I think illustrates very well how drug policy in Latin America, and especially drug policy discussions have changed. So on the left side of this slide, you see the picture of Gustavo de Grave, who was the Attorney General of Colombia in 1993, which is the time when the Colombian government was after Pablo Escobar. And Gustavo de Grave was the Attorney General in that presidential period. And as Attorney General, he led the fight against Escobar. And at some point, he came out publicly and actually came to a conference in Baltimore here in the US. And he said that he thought that the war against drugs was a failed endeavor, that unless drugs were legalized, the government was, that at that point, he said, we're just like missing and losing all these resources to go after Escobar. But then if Escobar is gone and the drug trade is still gonna be there. So he talked openly about legalization, and one of the outcomes of him doing that was that his visa was revoked. His visa to come to the US was revoked. President Cesar Gaviria, who later will become a champion of drug policy reform, actually asked Gustavo de Grave to step down and criticize his comments very harshly. And then we fast forward to 2015, and to the right side, you see the Minister of Defense of Colombia in 2015 under President Juan Manuel Santos, around the time right before the signing of the peace agreement in Colombia. And in 2015, Yesid Reyes, that's his name, he toured the US basically talking about how drug policy had failed and how it was important to consider changes in drug policy. And his positions, though maybe controversial for some, nobody came and revoked his visa, he didn't lose his position in the government, nothing happened to him. And I love this story because I think it illustrates really well how the discussion on policy, on drug policy, has changed in Latin America, even though, as we will see, the practice has not changed as much. But it's pretty, it is pretty telling and very interesting to understand how this change happened and how, even though the policies have not changed, the discussion has changed in a very significant way. So today I'm just gonna talk about 3 key points. And again, some of these resonate with some of the points made in the chapter that some of you may have read by Mónica Serrano, but others go a little further. So I'm just gonna talk again a little bit about how we think, or why we can say, talk about a failure of the war on drugs in Latin America particularly. Then talk a little bit about these changes in drug policy discourse that the anecdote that I just told illustrate. Think about how they came about, but also what are some of the limitations and why these changes in drug policy discourse are still lagging behind actual drug policy change. And then I want to switch gears a little to talk about particularly the importance of domestic factors in understanding the consequences of drug trafficking, and particularly what I will say is one of the worst consequences of drug trafficking and drug policy in Latin America, which is violence. So let me just go quickly to start talking about some of these consequences and why, this idea of the failure of the war on drugs. And I'm sure that probably some of these discussions are very familiar for the audience, but I think it's also worth kind of going through them again. So of course, I think the main reason why we talk about the failure of the war on drugs is because after 50 years, we don't see drug markets that are smaller, and what we see is actually more complex and bigger drug trafficking markets around the world. So just to give you an example, and this is just a recent period, if we went back 50 years, the contrast will be starker. So what you see here is a map of global cocaine flows around the world. So this map is from 2008, and what you see here is basically the arrows represent basically trafficking routes broadly, and the larger, or the thicker the arrow means the larger the drug trade flow. So as you see here, obviously the largest cocaine flow particularly has been from South America through Mexico and into the US, with the, some different ones going through Europe. This is 2008. And then you look at the same map in 2016, which is what you see here. And even in this past decade, when things have been changing, when we see like a more complex and a completely complex picture of drug trafficking markets. So as you see here, there are many more arrows. Some of those arrows have become thicker and others have become thinner. And basically what this means in plain terms is that we have, and this is just for cocaine again, which remains one of the most concentrated drug markets where most of the demand is in North America. But even though that's still the case, what we have seen with cocaine is that even cocaine has become a market that is much more fragmented around the world, but particularly that the drug trafficking routes have become more complex. And this is not only reflects the failure of the war on drugs because this has happened, but because a lot of this fragmentation has to do with drug trafficking organizations and drug trafficking actors adapting to law enforcement. So for example, there is a route for drug trafficking that became very puzzling when it emerged back in the late 1990s, which was drug trade going from South America through the southern part of South America, like Brazil, Argentina, around into West Africa, and from West Africa, sometimes back into Europe. So that's a very complicated route, but basically it's a route that is made to avoid law enforcement, and basically it's a result of drug trafficking organizations and drug trafficking actors adapting to law enforcement. So this market diversification, this fragmentation is a consequence of the war on drugs. Another thing that we really talk about very frequently when we talk about the consequences or the failures of the war on drugs is the fact that there are balloon effects. What we talk about balloon effects, as you know, when you squeeze a balloon in one end, it kind of pops up in the other. So that's a common metaphor to talk about the consequences of drug policy, because what has happened over time is that when the drug trade is successfully controlled in one place, or an aspect of the drug place is successfully controlled in one place, generally with some other consequences, but let's say it's control, that trade doesn't disappear. It just moves somewhere else. And that has been very clear with cocaine, which is even a much more limited market, because the production of coca leaf and cocaine is largely limited to Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru. And over the years, what we have seen, and this is what this graph that I have here illustrates, is that there has been kind of a compensation in this balloon effect, which basically when cocaine production has increased in one country, it has decreased in the others, and basically the overall level of drug production remains the same, of cocaine production particularly. A lot of my examples are from cocaine, just because it's, just to illustrate this, and is of course one of the main markets that affects South America. So you see here, for example, in purple is the potential cocaine production in Bolivia, the light blue is Peru, and the dark blue is Colombia. And this is a story that is well known among policy experts, and this is mentioned in the chapter you read, which is in the early 1990s, actually when Colombia started getting more involved in the drug trade, most of the cocaine production actually happened in Bolivia and Peru. And as some efforts to control cocaine production in Bolivia and Peru were successful, and many other things happened, that trade didn't just disappear, it moved to Colombia. So that has been more or less the story. And if you look at these graphs, you tend to see that some of the lines decrease, some of the others increase, which is basically a very visual illustration of this balloon effect. These are more recent years with coca bush cultivation, and it's the same story. And we can have, of course, a whole discussion here about how cocaine and coca leaf are two very different things. And one of the failures of the war on drugs has been an emphasis on coca leaf eradication, which has been it hasn't succeeded, and to a large extent, the cocaine production potential has remained the same despite all the efforts in eliminating coca crops. And again, as you see, more or less the picture has been one. So for example, as coca bush cultivation was decreasing in Colombia in the 2010s, it started to increase again in Peru and Bolivia. And as you may have seen or know, actually, Colombia recently reached the peak of its cocaine production potential in its history, despite all the efforts and all the money that has been put into cocaine and coca leaf control in Colombia. And this again is what this graph here shows. This is the specific case of Colombia. And what this graph is showing you, if you see in gray, is the hectares of coca cultivated in Colombia. And in yellow, you see the actual cocaine production potential. These two things have generally been treated as the same thing, basically how much coca is cultivated and how much cocaine production potential there has been. But it's different so you can have, depending on the type of coca leaf that you have, depending on the methods that are used to transform that coca leaf into cocaine, there can be different levels of productivity. So you can have more or less cocaine from the same amount of coca leaf, depending on many different characteristics. And one interesting thing that has happened in Colombia is that despite the fact that, for example, when there was a decline in coca cultivation, cocaine production potential remained stable for a while. And you can see that here, for example, in the past 3 or 4 years, coca cultivation has decreased, and this is the line that you see here, but cocaine production potential has actually increased very highly. And what you see also over time is that the production potential of cocaine has increased, and this is again a result of adaptation to drug control policies. So the more that that the people who engage in different aspects of coca production and cocaine in Colombia have to avoid drug control policies, the more they move into more sophisticated methods, the more they move coca production to places that are actually more complicated. And this is all because ultimately, in such a lucrative business, the main goal remains just to maintain the business going, even if there is a lot of law enforcement put on it. So over time, what law enforcement has done is to basically lead to adaptation by different criminal actors and different actors in the drug trafficking chains to be able to maintain production because it remains highly, highly profitable. And this is, again, one of the main failures of the war on drugs, which is the drug trades remain highly profitable, and the drug control policies, instead of making it less profitable, it have made them more profitable and move organizations to become more sophisticated and more savvy to adapt to drug control policies. Another aspect that we can consider when we talk about the failure of the war on drugs is, of course, drug use, and the fact that drug use has not decreased and it actually keeps increasing, and that we have not only we have more people using drugs today than we did when the war on drugs started, but we also have a much more fragmented and dispersed drug markets. So here, for example, I'm just showing these are relatively older statistics. So for example, in 2004, 2005, North America represented about 50% of cocaine users in the world. By 2011, the cocaine users had increased in Latin America, in Africa, around the world. The US and North America remain the largest cocaine market in the world, but drug use has really fragmented and increased. And again, so drug control policies are partially to blame for this also, because the more that as drug routes diversify, that also means that cocaine circulates through many more places than it used to. So again, these are all things that can be at some level attached to, or to a large extent, attached to drug control policies. And then we have the more domestic social consequences of the war on drugs. There are many, but internally in Latin America, and this is of course also known in the US, is that we have very disproportional drug penalties, meaning drug penalties, regardless of how severe the drug crime is, tend to be much higher than penalties for other crimes. So here, for example, in this graph, which has a lot of lines, but basically you see basically a timeline between the 1950s, and this graph goes until around 2012. And basically what is showing you is what was the highest minimum penalty for any drug-related crime. So for example, a drug-related crime, the minimum penalty will be, for example, possession rather than trafficking. So generally, these are penalties for possession of drugs. And what you can see here is that there are differences across Latin American countries. Not all countries have the same minimum penalties. But one thing is clear is since the 1950s, we have seen these penalties just increase over time. And then more clearly, and this stops in 2012. After 2012, some countries have implemented reforms, but the trend remains more or less the same, which is that the minimum penalty for drug-related crimes has been increasing over time. But most importantly, the penalties for drug crimes tend to be much higher than penalties for other serious crimes. So, for example, in this graph, we are comparing the maximum penalty here. Here we're talking about the maximum penalty for drug trafficking as a percentage of the maximum penalty for rape in a few selected Latin American countries. This graph is also comparing countries over time. So the pink shows the 1970s, the gray is 1990, and the brown is 2012. So basically the way of reading this graph is that any number over 100 means that the maximum penalty for drug trafficking is much higher than the maximum penalty for rape. And there are some variations over time, but there are only 3 cases where the penalty for drug trafficking is lower than the penalty for rape. In all the other cases in different countries, the penalties for drug trafficking have always been higher than the penalties for rape. Here, I'm not trying to say that certain drug trafficking crimes are not serious, but that there is clearly a disproportionality in how these crimes are treated. But also there is another layer of disproportionality that I'm not showing right now in graphs, but it's the fact that different aspects of the drug trade are treated very differently. And that happens in the US as well, right? So for example, the possession and trafficking end up having pretty much the same outcome, also because of the social characteristics of those who end up being in prison for those low-level crimes. And that has also led to another example, to another consequence of this. Again, also you can see this in the US, but it's clear for Latin America, which is prison overcrowding. And here I just want you to look at the left side of this graph, which is showing us how overcrowded prisons are in different places of the world. Of course, as the bar starts going over 0, that means that the prisons have more people than they are supposed to hold. And as you see here, Latin America and the Caribbean are basically the first place in the world in terms of prison overcrowding. And a lot of that prison overcrowding has to do with low-level drug crimes. So those are some, and I will go back to what I think is one of the main failures of the war on drugs in Latin America, which is, of course, violence, but I will talk about that in a second. So then I want to go to my second point, which is this change that occurred in drug discourses and drug policy. So in this picture, you see 3 former presidents of Latin America: Cesar Gaviria, who was the president under Pablo Escobar, and who, as I said before, at some point said he was completely against drug policy reform. Then you had Fernando Enrique Cardoso, who was the president of Brazil in the 1990s, and Ernesto Zedillo, who was president of Mexico. In 2009, these 3 guys created something called the Latin American Drug Policy Commission, or Commission on Drugs and Democracy. And they released a report that, in my view, created kind of a cascade effect in Latin America and around the world. And basically what this report said is the consequences of the war on drugs in Latin America have been very high. We haven't paid attention to the health dimension of drug trafficking problems and drug policy, and we have only paid attention to law enforcement. So basically the report talked about some of the failures of the war on drugs and proposed the notion to reconsider some drug policies. What I think was important about this report is that it kind of changed the tone of drug policy. This doesn't mean that people weren't talking about drug policy reform before, but the fact that these 3 presidents who were very influential, who were very well known in Latin America, Gaviria was the president of the Organization of American States for 10 years. So they kind of moved the drug policy debate to a different level in Latin America. And this was in 2009. And after that, we started seeing this cascade effect of events where sitting presidents and sitting officials started to talk about drug policy reform. So in 2013, for example, in the Americas Summit in Cartagena, sorry, this is a very blurry picture, but basically one outcome of this high-level meeting of governments in Latin America, they came out with a declaration and a plan to that basically was we need to reconsider and consider different scenarios for drug policy. And President Obama at the time supported this discussion, or at least didn't intervene in it. And a series of other events happened. 3 presidents, including the president of Colombia, the president of Guatemala, and the president of Mexico, called for holding the United Nations General Assembly special session on drugs to 2016. And this was a very important meeting for drug policy. And they asked to move that meeting before it had to happen. It was supposed to happen in 2019. And the notion was that something had to be changed about drug policy conventions. In the end, nothing came out of that General Assembly session for reasons we can discuss more. But again, some historical change. So what has changed is, again, talking about reform was more taboo, especially for high-level sitting officials and for presidents, and that changed. And what used to be more marginal and contradictory and discretional policies or alternative policies, like using substitution therapies or depenalizing personal use, became more mainstream. So a few countries in Latin America, like Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, and Mexico, had depenalized drug use before, but the implementation of that depenalization has been very piecemeal and not consistent. So even though Colombia, for example, did it in 1994, it was still very contradictory. So what happened after 2009 is that discussions about these things started to become more mainstream, and actually countries started implementing some reforms. So more notably, Bolivia in 2012 mobilized a lot of support to exclude coca leaf from the list of controlled substances in the United Nations conventions. We can talk about more about this in the Q&A, but that was a big mistake from the beginning in the drug control conventions that basically equated coca leaf to cocaine, and that affected traditional uses of coca in Bolivia. But Bolivia successfully mobilized support and was successfully able to exclude coca leaf from the conventions, and did some things that politically were not thinkable before. Colombia in 2015 took another bold step, which was to suspend the aerial fumigation of coca crops with glyphosate, which, as you know, is a highly toxic chemical, and also moved very strongly, and nowadays perhaps was the largest regulated medical marijuana market in Latin America. In Ecuador, for example, implemented a very serious change in the penal code, which had basically the objective of changing that disproportionality that I was talking about. So basically, what Ecuador did was to change the penalty so that low-level crimes will not be treated the same way, and also actually tried to take some people who were convicted on those crimes out of prison. This decision, however, was reversed in 2015. Brazil, for example, has implemented some interesting programs. One is known as the Brazos Abertos, which is open arms, and is basically one of the largest public use open drug use market in Latin America. And it has been very successful in many ways. And of course, perhaps the biggest one was the fact that Uruguay was the first country in the world to create a regulated market for marijuana for all uses, including recreational. I say regulated market because actually Uruguayans don't like to call it legalization, but this is basically what we all know as the legalization of marijuana in Uruguay. So these were all great things, but we haven't been able to see many more radical changes. And let me see how I'm doing on time. Well, first of all, let me talk about why I think this change happened. I think that one of the reasons was basically that the costs of drug policy have become too high in the region. And this is what I want to talk about: violence, particularly violence. Violence is not new. It varies across regions. Not all Latin America is violent, and not all violence has to do with the drug trade. But it is clear that the drug trade is one of the drivers of violence in Latin America. And I think a recognition and a growing recognition of this was one of the driving forces behind these changes that we have seen. The fact that drug use problems have grown. And in some cases, I will say we have really bad statistics about drug use. Sometimes what's seen as a recent change has happened for a while. So part of this is perception, part of this is reality, but it is clear that drug use problems have become more notable in Latin America. And this has been another impetus for change. I would say another key factor, especially during the Obama years, but even before, was a change in relation with the US. And this basically means that Latin America ceased to be the main policy priority for the US, as the Middle East kind of took a more important geopolitical interest for the US. And I think this also opened the space for this whole discussion to happen without becoming too complicated in the relation with the US. And I think most importantly, it was the Mexico effect. It's the fact that drug-related violence has skyrocketed in Mexico. And I think this was another key catalyst for the changes in the debates. So I think these changes, this is just to show you a visual representation of the problem of violence in Latin America. So in this graph, basically you see homicide rates for different regions or for different continents in the world, continents as understood by the United Nations. And you see here, for example, that the global homicide rate is 6.1, which means six victims of homicide per 100,000 people. The Americas, and here the US is included, but for the Americas, the homicide rate is much larger than for anywhere else in the world. Latin America specifically concentrates about only 9% of the world's population, but it concentrates out 30% of the homicides in the world. So it has a much larger share of homicides. And again, drug trafficking is not the only reason behind this, and this is very important to say, but it is clear that organized crime and the drug trade are one of the driving forces behind this violence. So these are some of the reasons why there has been an impetus to discuss drug policy, to discuss drug trafficking. But unfortunately, behind this impetus, there are many obstacles for change. At the domestic level, I think Monica Serrano's piece does a great job in understanding, for example, why there are so many bureaucratic interests in the US that will make it very complicated to think about eliminating drug policy, you know. But internally in Latin America, there are many policy contradictions. So many of the examples I gave before are policies that were more progressive, to put it in some way, have been happening at the same time that more traditional, hardcore, militarized responses to drug trafficking happen. So there are lots of policy contradictions. A portion of the public in Latin America remains skeptical about reforming drug policy, remains skeptical about ideas of legalization. Again, and I think this is not just about Latin America, but in general, there is more consensus about the need to change marijuana regulations, but other drugs remain very much taboo. Harder drugs, cocaine, heroin. So there has been some advance in marijuana, but thinking about other drugs remains very complicated. Also, what political leaders do matter a lot. And we've had many leaders in Latin America that successfully run on platforms that are about zero tolerance to drugs or to crime. That's the case at some point of Mauricio Macri, who was the former president of Argentina, right-wing President Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, or current Colombia's president, Iván Duque. I will say that another big obstacle for change, and this I think will connect as I try to go quickly through my last point, is that any change in drug policy to be effective will require a commitment to broader reforms in other things, like the justice system, better health systems, for example. So if you want to provide better healthcare for drug users or better prevention, you really need a better healthcare system, reforms in prisons, and of course to address many socioeconomic issues. So it's not just reforming drug policies, like thinking about these things. And lastly, I think we still have much more clarity about what's the best way to treat use and demand for drugs differently. And we have a lot less on how to control supply. Basically, you know, people are more sympathetic of saying, yeah, we don't need to track drug users and as criminals than they will be to say, you know what, like, what do we do with the drug traffickers? How do we actually prevent the markets from growing? So there is still a lot more, like, it's much more easy to support progressive policies on demand than on supply. And that's very, very important, for example, for Colombia right now. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A. So the last thing that I want to talk about briefly before I finish is the importance of understanding domestic dimensions. And what I mean here is that politics matter a lot. I'm a political scientist. I think that many of the problems that we see with drug trafficking and drugs today have to do with the war on drugs, have to do with international conventions that we have. But to really understand the picture, we also have to understand local politics and how they matter. So drug trafficking and violence are definitely connected, but to really understand that connection, we really need to understand local political dynamics. And that's really well illustrated in the case of Mexico. So Mexico has had issues with drug trafficking since at least the 1950s. But violence, as we are seeing it today, is a relatively new phenomenon. So what you see in this graph is homicide rates in Mexico in the most recent period, between 1997 and 2020. And basically what has happened in Mexico is that since 2006, so right here, Mexico has seen one of the worst deteriorations in public security that we have seen in any country in Latin America. Homicide rates have skyrocketed. There was a little lull in between 2012 and 2015, but the general tendency since 2006 is a very rapid increase in violence, a very rapid increase in homicides. And a lot in the driver of this has been policies of the Mexican government and the consequences that those policies have had on the interactions of different criminal groups that are mostly related and have to do a lot with drug trafficking. But one of the difficulties in Mexico today is precisely that drug trafficking organizations are also involved in many more illicit markets. So what happened in 2006 and the reason different factors conflict were together in explaining why Mexico has seen this deterioration of public security. Some of those have to do with the general consequences of the war on drugs, the fact that more markets had been moving to Mexico, that cocaine became more central for drug trafficking organizations. But it also had to do with the fact that as violence started to increase, the response of the Mexican government in 2006 was to completely militarize the war against trafficking organizations. And what that decision of the Mexican government created was a situation where criminal groups are starting to fragment more and more. So instead of controlling them, what we have seen in Mexico is a complete deterioration and a complete explosion of the number of trafficking groups, which has also increased the disputes among them. But the third factor, which is really important to understand what happened in Mexico, is that drug trafficking in Mexico used to be controlled politically. And it was controlled politically because there was one party that controlled politics in Mexico, and that was the PRI. As the PRI started to lose control of Mexican politics, then this also started to fragment the networks of protection and collusion that existed between criminals and politicians in Mexico. So today we have a lot of corruption and a lot of collusion between politicians and traffickers in Mexico. But it's not centralized. And because it's so fragmented, that creates a lot of conflicts of power. And that also is part of the reason why we have seen this amount of violence in Mexico. And I just wanna close my presentation today illustrating this with one particular example, because one thing that is very important to understand too is that even though violence has increased in Mexico as a whole, it is also geographically concentrated. It's not that the entire Mexico is full of violence. It has been dispersing geographically more and more, but there are differences. So in this graph, for example, I showed you the homicide rates of 3 cities that I researched for my book, which are Tijuana, Ciudad Juárez, and Mexico. And I'm gonna focus here, and the red line here is Mexico. This blue line is Ciudad Juárez, which is the border city across El Paso, Texas. And this gray line here is Tijuana, which is the border city across from San Diego. And I wanna talk about San Diego, and as I was about Tijuana. And as I was preparing this presentation, I was thinking, what example can I use to illustrate this? And I decided to talk about Tijuana, which is the homicide rates that you see here, for one reason, which is Tijuana borders San Diego, probably the closest Mexican city to Oregon, I will say. But most importantly, Tijuana has seen, in the past week, 3 journalists were killed in Tijuana, in a revival of a violence that some people thought was gone. So basically what you see here, Tijuana has always had trafficking organizations operating. Homicide rates were relatively stable for most of the 1990s. And then you see here in 2006, a spike in homicides that then declines. And this was a period, so 2006 again is when the Mexican government declares a militarized war against trafficking organizations. In Tijuana, there were disputes between 2 main cartels. And when the military was deployed in Tijuana, many of these disputes just got worse. But then eventually Tijuana was actually labeled a miracle. And the homicide rates declined significantly between 2010 and 2011. And this led many people to say, okay, we won the war, drug traffickers are defeated. But again, what was behind this was more politics rather than any change in drug trafficking. So what happened in 2010-11 in Tijuana is that first a cartel kind of dominated, a trafficking organization was able to dominate again the city, reducing the conflicts. And different parts of the government were able to coordinate more successfully a policy that was very militarized, but that successfully controlled some organizations in Tijuana, but without completely eliminating either criminal groups or drug trafficking or corruption. So what happened in 2011 is that really kind of high-level flashy homicides disappeared, but in the outskirts of the city, people were still being killed and nobody was really paying attention to them. And those things have kept escalating over the years. So today we're seeing a Tijuana, again, that has disputes between different criminal groups, a much more fragmented political landscape, but also, and this is what I wanna finish for today, also a situation that has been worsened but by other policies, not just drug policies. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with a policy informally known as Remain in Mexico, but it's basically a policy that sends back to Mexico people who are trying to enter the US to get asylum. Those people aren't, if they are not received in the border of the US, they are sent back to camps in Mexico. These are people from Central America, from Mexico, from many parts of the world. And what ends up happening is that many people end up in camps like the one that you see here, which is basically tents wherever they can. And this has become another breeding ground for social problems, but also for criminal groups to prey on these people, not only to prey on them, but people who have no other options will much rather probably go to work with a criminal organization than to just stay there without food or being preyed by them. So a situation that was already complicated is being made worse by aspects and policies like this. This is just to say, I guess we have a lot to change in drug policy. We know it's hard, but also it's very important to understand the local conditions and how they interact in very complicated ways with this larger framework of drug policy. So I'm so sorry, I think I've talked a lot, but I'm gonna stop here and hopefully have some time for discussion or some questions.
Great, thanks a lot. Hey, this is Tim DeRoche. Angélica, great presentation. We've got some questions coming in from the audience, and I'm going to dive in with a few of my own. You ended talking about one of the wrinkles in this that I think we don't think about a lot, which is immigration policy. But the other thing that really got me thinking while you were speaking is drug trafficking relies heavily on legal trade to camouflage its activities, as well as people-to-people interactions. So how have COVID-19 and supply chain issues affected the illicit drug trade between Latin America and the US? And how have cartels adapted to the pandemic?
So that's a great question. And I think just to keep my answers short so that we can accommodate more, I will say initially there was a big impact of COVID-19. I will say the first months of 2020 were months that really affected the supply of drugs, and of some drugs particularly. So for example, the production of methamphetamines in Mexico was affected strongly because a lot of the primary of the bases come from China, and that was one of the first things that was disrupted. However, what has happened over time is that we've seen, I think that the consequence of this it was momentary that it was so radical. Most organizations, especially the larger ones, have some stockpiles. There was some stockpiling in the US. So there was some disruption, of course, but the response to disruption, I think, what has happened is it has made stronger organizations even stronger, because in a moment like this, the organizations that are able to adapt and respond more to those disruptions in supply are the ones that have better connections and more power. So one thing that we're seeing is that we're starting to see some of the organizations that have more ability becoming more dominant in the market. But another consequence has been, again, this fragmentation and diversification. So the responses to supply chain disruptions have been to try and change routes, to try to change sources, and to try to change also destinations. So we have seen, for example, the renaissance, or not renaissance, but a strengthening of drug trafficking routes through Central America, because that facilitates avoiding certain aspects of the supply chain issues. So there are a lot of complex issues here, but I said, yes, there was a disruption, a very strong disruption at the beginning, but most drug trafficking markets seem to be well and alive at this point. And you can see that in many different indicators. So for example, seizures of cocaine at the border in the US were low at some point during the 2020s, but they have been high again. And seizures of cocaine, for example, have been particularly high in Europe. So it doesn't seem that the disruption was really long-term, and it seems that those that have taken more advantage of that have been those who have more power to do so, which is, of course, more complicated.
So legalization efforts in the US are often touted as helping counter dependence on opioids, yet we're seeing kind of a move away from cocaine and a spike in illegal and dangerous fentanyl analogs streaming into the country and being on our streets. How do you think the US should approach this balance between controlling the flow and looking at legalization?
So I think those are kind of two different things, right? I think, so the increase in fentanyl is, I think at this point we should understand problems of drug use as the US has traditionally understood them as a response to supply, right? So whenever there is an increase of any kind of drug use in the US, the general response of the US towards Latin American countries is saying, this is a problem of supply, right? So we have more fentanyl because Mexican organizations are pushing more fentanyl. And that's true to some extent, but there are also the demand side issues. So I think how can we approach this? It starts with understanding that a big part of the problem starts with demand, right? So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be paying attention to supply and why Mexican organizations have evolved into the more lucrative fentanyl markets. But that I think the key thing is to understand always that the issue starts with the demand and the reasons that explain why demand increases. So I think the first thing is not to avoid the same mistakes of the past, right? Which is just thinking that by crushing on supply somehow the demand is going to disappear, when generally the only thing that does is to actually strengthen the profits that organizations have. I will say that it's very balanced approaches are difficult. I think that controls or more focus on prevention, for example, or better treatment policies are good, but they alone are not going to change what happens in Mexico. So it has to be a very balanced. I think Mexico needs a lot of support right now. And that brings me back to your first point, Tim, which is immigration policy. I think immigration policy is really getting in the way right now of dealing with problems in Mexico, because so the Mexican government recently has agreed on many immigration policy control things that the US has requested, in exchange of the US not requesting certain things from the Mexican government regarding drug policy. So in the end, this is making the situation for migrants worse, and is not allowing to any kind of serious addressing of the threat that Mexican groups and the relations with politicians create in Mexico. So it's really, I know my answer here is not very clear, but I think because as a serious scholar, I think any attempt at thinking that these things are solved with one policy stroke is probably a source of the problem. This requires attention from many angles, and also a careful consideration of how different policies interact.
So do you think that hardline immigration policies over the last few years have made the discussion more difficult or created more obstacles for really being able to approach the issue?
Yes, I don't think that's new. And I think it's important that we all recognize that immigration policies have had a very complicated interaction with drug policy for a while. But in the past few years, for obvious reasons, it has been worse. So for example, Remain in Mexico, which is this policy I was talking about, which is basically about returning people who are applying for asylum, but where it doesn't seem that they have enough basis for asylum, or they don't receive an audience right away, they are sent back to Mexico. And what has happened is that it has created this enormous, almost concentration camps. But camps were basically of migrants that have no connection to the cities that they are being deported to. And this is worsening a situation that is already complicated in those border cities. But the Mexican government on its part is not opposing that, because the Mexican government, particularly the current one, is also receiving some perks out of just being of supporting the US Remain in Mexico protocols. So yes, it has complicated the situation more. It's not new. This is not something new, but it has complicated the situation more with certain specific aspects of drug policy. And also just mainly because we have larger migration crises, right? So in those migration crises, of course, have to do with complicated situations in many countries around the world, but particularly in Central America, which themselves can be traced back to immigration policies and security policies. So this is all interconnected in complicated ways, yes.
So from your perspective, what is or should be the difference or distinction between drug policy, strategies against organized crime, and policies to reduce violence?
Oh, that's a great question. I think they are all interconnected but separated. I think any policy, so for example, I will put an example. Sometimes you can control violence and not necessarily eliminate drug trafficking organizations or criminal organizations. And sometimes actually violence control goes hand in hand with allowing the monopoly of an organization to flourish. So in some ways, violence, I do think that any kind of organized crime control policy will be more effective if it is more selective in nature. It means if it is not just going after drug trafficking, but also after the most violent, corrupt consequences of drug trafficking. I think the most effective organized control policy is actually not just going after the drug traffickers, but after the networks, political networks that support them. Guatemala has kind of a relatively nice success story trying to do this through something that's called the CICIG, which is basically an international commission whose main mandate was to dismantle networks of organized crime in Guatemala, but recognizing that those networks were not just the criminals, were not just the Pablo Escobars, but it was like really deep networks that connected police and politicians. And that commission actually had large scale cases that were not going after specific crimes, but trying to go after the structures. And separating those things means that the focus is not just going after one criminal lord or after one drug trafficking route, because that's the one thing that has been tremendously counterproductive, but is more going after the worst consequences, but also thinking in terms of structures. Thinking of, we don't go after the drug lord, but we go after the structure that sustains that. But that's complicated, but because those networks are the most powerful ones, honestly. And those have to do with politicians, those have to actually with legal interest, and that makes it more complicated. But it was possible at some level in Guatemala, so I don't think it's completely impossible, but it requires a lot of institutional support. It requires support from the US. Actually, that commission had to leave Guatemala after the US withdrew support from that in the past administration. So the US can also support those kinds of efforts, which will be much more effective than focusing on how many hectares of coca are eliminated or how many drug lords are incarcerated.
So do you think the tighter border measures have increased cartel activity in the US?
Yes, in some ways, yes, because for different reasons. I think the first one is that the harder it is to get to the border, the more you need the support of people who actually know how to get across the border. So the harder it is to get through the border, the more likely people are to recur to smugglers. And those smugglers used to be less organized and have become more organized over time, precisely because it has become a more lucrative business. And it becomes a more lucrative business, the harder it is to get. And the more people there are, of course. And then, of course, what has happened is that so human smuggling and drug trafficking are not always completely tied, and sometimes we have like really overblown histories about that, or overblown stories. But over time, there seems to be evidence that indeed, the harder the immigration controls have been, especially in the past years in Mexico, the more that organized crime is engaging more both in human smuggling, but also using human smugglers to move drugs. So the two markets have become much more entrenched. So that becomes more notable the harder in the border controls are. So yes.
So let's bring it back to Oregon. Oregon decriminalized possession of small amounts of almost all hard drugs, which was really a groundbreaking step away from arrest, charge, jail model of possession, which has essentially been the centerpiece since Nixon declared the war on drugs. Many see this as a major victory towards systemic change in US drug policy. How do you think this policy, if it were to expand to other states or federally, would change the dynamic of US Latin American approaches to drug traffic?
So I think it's great, and I've always admired Oregon for being a kind of ahead of the curve in that. I do think these things matter a lot, and if it was to expand, it's the same thing that happened with marijuana. So to some extent, marijuana regulations have changed because has been some kind of diffusion effect, right? The more that you see different states in the US, in different countries around the world, kind of making more flexible their marijuana regulations without really creating enormous security problems, or even enormous increases in use. There is some debates there, but that you can do this in a controlled way, I think that creates a demonstration effect. Now, as I was saying before, when I was talking about the obstacles for reform, there are still many obstacles. So for example, in Latin America, despite the fact that discussions about marijuana regulations or marijuana legalization have become more popular, despite the fact that there have been many more of those, only a few countries have actually changed their regulations. And that has to do with the things I was talking about before, or even in the US, right? Like many people argue that it's unlikely that we will see all 50 states doing recreational marijuana because there is a clear pattern in which states are not doing it, right? And it has to do with the preferences of the population, with the political leanings of different places. So I think it's really important, the step that Oregon took, because the more we have evidence that policies can be implemented, the more it creates that demonstration and diffusion effect and makes people less fearful of implementing those reforms. But I think that going forward, what we will see regarding drug policy in the world is a patchwork of places where you have a few more progressive regulations and other places that don't. And the problem that that creates for supply countries like Latin American ones is that in the end, the incentives for drug trafficking networks remain because there's still lucrative businesses in basically in the cracks of those different legal frameworks. So on the positive side, yes, I think it's very important. This is a step forward, and it's going to be interesting to see what are the consequences of and how the whole regime works in Oregon. But on the negative side, or the more skeptical side, where that's going to be diffusing in a rapid and homogeneous way across the world, that's much more unlikely. On the positive side, I will see that there is some evidence, and I have some colleagues who have started to document, for example, how changes in marijuana markets did lead to Mexican organizations losing control of those markets. The downside is that might be one connecting to a fentanyl discussion. Criminal groups diversify too. So you may have less incentives in one illegal market, but then you move to another one. So just to be positive, yes, this is great. And I think the more different jurisdictions implement these kinds of reforms and experiment with them, because I don't think we're going to find the right policy right away, to be honest. And thinking that we're just gonna magically find a one that tells us what's the perfect policy framework that we want for drugs is unrealistic. But as the former president of Uruguay said, if something is not working, then we have to keep finding ways to change it until we find where it works. So I think in that sense, it's really amazing what Oregon has done. And I do think it's gonna motivate more jurisdictions in the US to implement similar things.
Great. Fabulous unpacking of a really, really complex issue. I want to thank you for such a fantastic presentation. I want to bring Derek back on to take us out into the day. And thanks so much for joining us from hopefully sunny Lowell, Mass.
Oh, no, lots of snow here, but thank you so much for having me.
I just want to echo my thanks to Professor Durán-Martínez. Really fascinating discussion. I hope that you, audience, you saw in the chat, we posted a link where you can buy her book. And so encourage you to consider doing that. It's wonderful to have you all here joining us for Great Decisions, which will resume the 5th talk next week at this time on Myanmar and ASEAN. In between then, we have a program this Sunday, posting the chat on long reads, which if you like reading articles and having discussions about it, long reads just may be for you. It takes an article, the link of say of a New York Times magazine article or the Atlantic Monthly or something, and then has a discussion group on it. This one is about corruption in Lebanon and the challenges there. And then I really want to highlight coming up on February 24th, I mentioned this sort of discussion with Professor Christopher McKnight-Nichols, the transition from pandemic to possibly endemic for COVID-19 and parallels with the 1918 flu. Should be fascinating. It's an evening program co-sponsored with the Oregon Historical Society. All those and our other events are on our website, worldoregon.org. Professor, thanks again for your time and your expertise. Audience, thanks for your great questions. Everyone stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you.